social media in general has just made it very challenging to just have those conversations where it's defined. So like doing this with you guys, it is the best way. I mean, we're humans. We need to be able to like look each other in the eye, even though we're in 3 different states, and be able to like have this conversation, flesh things out. It's very challenging to do it, when you're in front of a screen, you're doing it through text, and you feel like you're on stage for all the other people that are watching and gonna like or retweet this, and it's a very odd way of communicating. This is not. So like doing more of these long form discussions is where like I think there's probably more appetite for this than there has been in years. I think people are just clamoring for that. So I guess aligned with like keep doing what you guys are doing, because it's an important thing that is not out there as much as it should, and it's very important for the discourse and just seeing people for good faith debaters. It lowers the temperature, and then that is just a good thing these days. So props to you guys for putting these shows out there.
This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host, XJ. As always, he is my brilliant co-host, Geoff. And today, Geoff, we have another brilliant basketball mind with us. We're super excited and pumped to talk to this guy because even though we have many differences in how we view the game, we have a ton of respect for, each other's perspectives. We're going to have a super interesting conversation here. We have my Knicks Film School colleague, one of the very best film analysts in the business right now, DJ. You can follow him at DJ Ace NBA at Twitter, on Twitter. DJ, thanks for being on with us, my guy. I'm super excited for this one.
Gentlemen, how are we? I'm super excited as well. I've listened to probably every episode you guys have put out. Huge fan of what you guys are doing in this space. It's really needed, the way you guys discuss the game and the respect that, as you alluded to, XJ, with how you treat differing points of view. All 3 of us have discussed things on the X platform and KFS chat rooms and had robust discussions. So very excited to have it for the first time with the 3 of us on a microphone in front of a camera. So it should be very fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Totally agree. How you feeling, Geoff? What's up?
I'm doing great. I always love when we have guests on because I don't have to like answer that question. I always feel awkward. every week it's the same, like I did the same things, and I'm excited to talk basketball.
All right, Geoff. That's how Geoff segues right into the content. That's how we get straight to it.
That's an awesome canned answer. I just love talking basketball. I mean, you can't really beat that, right?
Can't beat that. No, can't beat that. So like I said, DJ, the 3 of us have had a number of disagreements, but we agree on a ton. Like we were talking right before we started recording, and you were like, yeah, I think we probably agree on like 85 to 90% of things, and I would agree with that. Like it's just we really fine tune and harp on the things that we disagree with, because that's like where the interesting conversations are, honestly. But we use particular tools to analyze and evaluate the game and particular players. And not only do Geoff and I have disagreements with you, DJ, but Geoff and I disagree on things that you and Geoff might agree on, and so I don't think there's just kind of unanimity in those agreements or disagreements. So I think we did want to hash out some of those differences. Like I said, that's where the interesting conversations are, on some of the broader thoughts about the NBA, some of the specific things as it relates to players, coaching decisions, team directions. So we'll just dive in, and this might be a pretty short topic. I'm not sure. We'll see. But I do think it's something that's important to start with. I wanted to propose what I think is a key distinction when it comes to analyzing basketball. I think we can kind of create broad buckets of analysis, and categorize things as sort of strategy versus tactics. And, I played chess since I was a kid, so maybe that's why I think about things this way. But I kind of think of strategy as evaluating kind of the longer term approach to winning. So it could be the principles a team prioritizes, like only shooting layups and threes, playing really physical and aggressive defense, trying to force turnovers, prioritizing rebounds, determining the kinds of shots a team wants to allow defensively, because you have to allow something. And then I think of tactics as shorter term approaches that are kind of executed within the broader strategy, like running spread pick and rolls or ISOs on offense, icing wing screen and rolls on defense, or aggressively blitzing and trapping pick and rolls, whatever the case may be, determining how often to let players play in a flow or calling specific sets at whatever point in time. So to me, there would definitely be some overlap here between these broad buckets. But I guess my question for you is, do you think this is a reasonable distinction? And do you think that there are different tools or types of analysis or ways of thinking that could be useful in making decisions for each of these kinds of approaches, strategic versus tactical? And also, like, would you want to add anything to this framework? Would you want to change it? Just generally, what are your thoughts there?
I think it's good framing. And if you indulge me a little bit, I'll bring it to the team I cover the most, a team we've talked about a lot, and that's the Knicks. And I feel like they're a really interesting organization to sort of use as the barometer here when you talk about what are the strategy or what are the principles versus the tactics or the X's and O's that feed into those principles, because they are very intertwined. And you can have all these tactical thoughts and robust playbooks, but if you aren't prioritizing those things, whether it's practice or offseason, anything of that nature, those things are going to fall short, and vice versa. So I think for the Knicks, to use them as the example here, they have a head coach that has for many years, arguably his entire career, like believed in certain tenets, and it's low risk. It's to have more control, I think, of certain things than most coaches are attaining to have. I think Tibbs and this is, I think, a fault of his at times, where he wants to have his ability because of his preparation, because of the things he likes to do. He wants to be able to control certain aspects of the game. And I think the one area where the Knicks have done well since he's been here that he can control is the low turnovers. And I feel like as an offense, if you think about how the Knicks are run, especially since they brought in Jalen Brunson, a low turnover point guard, they've really been able to lean into that aspect of like, all right, shots are going to be missed. But I always feel like we fall into the trap as in terms of the analysis of like, it's a make or miss league, which I think for the most part, it probably is, but you can still struggle offensively shooting the ball, have a low effective field goal. But if you're not turning it over and you're doing other things on the defensive end, you can still have a chance to win a game. And I feel like that's why the Knicks have been a relatively successful regular season team because of those aspects. So like the low turnover stuff, it's like, if you're going to run a lot of high screen and roll with Jalen Brunson, you know that you're going to have a point guard that's relatively risk averse in terms of like some of the Luka cross court passes to the weak side. He's very rarely stripped of the ball because his handle is so robust and it's so strong that you don't get a lot of live ball turnovers with him. So if he's controlling the ball at the level that he's controlling it with, you can limit turnovers based just on that. Even factoring in when Julius Randle, that is, when he's healthy, you're going to get some Randle bad passes, Randle spin moves into the help defender. You're going to get some turnovers baked into his game. So to have a point guard that can limit those things, to me, feeds into this idea, like if you're going to have a low turnover principle, you're going to run an offense that's going to try to abide by that principle. And the best way to do that is to have your high usage point guard to be relatively low risk averse, but be very effective in the sort of sets they run, which, Brunson, in terms of scoring for himself and whether it's a pocket pass or hitting certain, passes on the weak side, when that pass is open, he can do those things effectively in terms of points per possession, but not turn the ball over at the level that's going to make a coach like Thibodeau, a little bit uncomfortable, which I think is where the Knicks offense sort of like builds from: the low turnovers, ball in the hands of Brunson, and then you kind of build off there.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great answer. I was almost like forgetting that I had to follow up because I was just so locked into the answer. Can you imagine Tibbs coaching Halliburton? I was thinking, like, when we were going to get to this, how Brunson is so almost entirely antithetical to Halliburton as in terms of their player profiles.
Yep.
And it's just funny to me to imagine like them trying to maximize Halliburton, but Halliburton making all these like jump passes and shooting all these threes, and Tibbs just being like, no, I just want a bucket right now. I just need 2 points right now, please. But I think that's a really interesting, those two players are actually a really interesting juxtaposition to this conversation, because if you look at, some of the best top-down metrics, some of the best, just some of the best metrics we have, Brunson, Halliburton are super similar players. Like they're producing about the same levels of impact pretty much unanimously. But Brunson does it in this very safe, very consistent way that's almost, you can rely on it. You can set your watch to it. He has these high floor 2-pointers. He's really consistent from 3. Whereas Halliburton, I'd say, is more just what he does. It's not, possession by possession, he's creating baskets by himself, but it's what he does for the entirety of the offense. And so I think back to the original question, this matters because which player you might prioritize or which player you might prefer might just come down to what your overall strategy is as a team, as an organization. If you're willing to live with a little bit more volatility, or if you prefer, to DJ's point, a safer, higher floor form of offense, I think you would go Brunson. And I think Brunson really, really leans into with the types of shots he takes. You're going to get more offensive rebounds from that short mid-range because he pulls the big up to you, which makes Mitch's life easier. He's either going to make it or Mitch is going to have a really good chance of getting that offensive rebound. So I think this overall discussion of tactics versus strategy is baked into almost any discussion you can have about team building and roster building. And I just think you could really talk about it for a long time.
Yeah, and it goes on the defensive end as well. I think this is a little bit of a cliche because he's gotten out of this sort of pattern, but you think of a Tibbs defense, it's heavy drop, it's play over the top, point of attack, rear contest, try as best you can to limit some of the backside help required because you're playing that defense. But to his credit, he has, and now this might be different with Hartenstein now, not on the roster anymore, but he was with Isaiah more willing to play at the level. With Sims, he's more willing to switch. But with Robinson, it's primarily against it, unless it's like a Donovan Mitchell guard you're trying to limit. And with the pull-up game, you're going to primarily play him in drop. But any drop defense is going to, when it's working, sort of be low, risk adverse in a way, or low risk. And where the Knicks and where some teams can get into trouble when you have this sort of like heavy gap help drop coverage, you're gonna, when the Knicks are not well oiled, they're over helping. And you can even see this with a guy like Quickly, who was a fantastic help defender, but when things would go haywire last year or 2 years ago, when he was like really at his peak defensively for the Knicks, it was when he would overhelp. It would be when Grimes would be in the gap too far. And with, when now as an organization, you're trying to give Tibbs the tools to implement this defense and maybe, provide it to enough tools to be at its peak, to have guys like Mikal Bridges and Anunoby that have a little more length to where, like, if you're going to be heavy gap help, you could recover back onto those wing or slot shooters and get a better contest. So that's where, like, you got to have synergy. You guys talk all the time about that in terms of on court, and then obviously with the front office and the head coach, the Knicks do. And I think most teams have this, well-run teams have this synergy between the front office and the head coach. You guys have, I'm sure, all about, like, whenever a player would get rumored to go to the Warriors, a really smart way of analyzing that would be, can that player prosper in that type of offense, which requires a high level awareness, a lot of cutting, a lot of like just heady basketball. You can't just put any player in the Warriors system and say, all right, now you're going to thrive. You can't put any player in the Utah Jazz system and thrive. Like, if you swapped out Julius Randle and Lauri Markkanen, like, I don't think Julius can play in that system. They would have to change a lot of things. So you got to have the right players for the system you're going to run. So it goes, there's many levels to this, but I find that when teams are really locked in to where you believe in what the coach, those principles, those way of thinking, those really important like things, those guiding principles, and you give that coach those players, that's when you could really have sustained success. And that's where I think the Knicks are. That's where the Warriors have been for many years. Good teams have that.
I just want to hop in before I turn it over to XJ real quick. I love the point you made about the Knicks defense, because if you think back to the 2021-2022 season, which I'm sure many Knicks fans want to forget existed entirely, the lowest moments of that season were all in an effort to try to implement one of Tibbs's principles, and that was protecting the rim. And so you can set your watch to opposing offenses exploiting our weak side guards or wings, digging into the paint to try and stunt on the drive. And the corner threes were just wide open because defenses hadn't evolved fast enough to take care of that next step yet, at least a mediocre defense like the Knicks was then. Yep. And I think it's a great example of what you're talking about, where I think the front office and Tibbs in lockstep said, okay, we respect that one of your principles is you don't want to just give up layups. You believe in stunt and recovery. You believe in asking your guys to do this. But we can't have these open threes anymore. That can't be a thing. We can't trade off layups for open threes. The math just doesn't work there. And to be honest, obviously there are still mishaps and, guys screw up. That happens. They're human. But in 2 seasons, I don't think we've seen consistent, oh, look, the opposing team knows they're going to stunt and they're just creating threes relentlessly. I actually think that's been Tibbs making an effort to be almost what's the word? Compromise on his principles. He's not giving up his principles, but he's saying, okay, if we're going to protect the rim like this, I'm also going to make sure that we're not just giving up a slew of open threes. And I think that was just a great point that you made.
I totally agree. I love everything you both said. I think the main thing that comes to mind when you were talking, DJ, is at what point do you build your strategy to your personnel versus acquiring your personnel for your strategy? In the biggest conversation I can think of that comes to mind for me around the Knicks world is whether and how often Julius Randle or OG Anunoby will play the 5. And if strategically, right, the tools that we use to assess that kind of thing, and that's why I'm making the distinction. So we use a lot of math and data to assess what we think would be the most effective strategy. And the tools that we use to do that tell us that it would be most effective if one of those two guys is spending a reasonable amount of time at the 5. What do we do in that situation? Do we say, well, the coach has this strategic approach, so we follow what he does, and we make a potentially negative value trade-off when we're talking about trading a guy like Deuce McBride, let's say for a worse player who actually fits the strategic approach that the coach has, a 5, let's say, who could protect the rim. We wouldn't have to play OG or Randall at the 5. Everything would kind of fall into place with how the coach likes to strategically approach things. Or do we say, well, we're just going to have to build our strategy to the personnel that we have and do the thing that we think would be most effective, given what the data may say. So that, I guess, that's the biggest question.
It's a great question. I think to me, it's the latter, especially now with the pieces that he has. And I think he tipped his hand last year. I think it was Fred Katz, friend of the show, right? Fred Katz.
Friend of the show.
I think he had mentioned that Tibbs was more willing to play or wanted to play Anunoby at the 5 more last year, but just the injuries and the lack of available bodies just made that a tougher call. So I think if you don't see that, and let's say the Knicks do go out midseason and try to give him another center to play the backup minutes or the starter minutes, for example, and go away from that small ball lineup, I think that would be a very poor decision and one that would deserve criticism, because I think you have Anunoby on this roster now, to me, because of his versatility, and one of his great abilities is the fact that you can be comfortable with him basically playing with Randall and being the 5 on defense, and then the 4, so to speak, on offense, spacing and allowing Randall to maybe tap into that Pelicans version where he's getting downhill, playing in the pocket, those sorts of things where you're going to need that because you don't have Hartenstein anymore, who was your best short roll player on the team last year. So you're going to have to replace that if Brunson is going to be heavily covered or aggressively covered in pick and rolls, which we assume will happen again this coming season. So I don't think you can. I think in this example, you have to adjust your principles based on the talent that you have, because it's overwhelming in terms of where you are better likely to have your best players on the court. The only way that happens with the depth of this roster, this Knicks roster, is if you have Anunoby play or Randall, whoever you want to figure it out, one of those two guys playing considerable minutes. at the 5, and that could be something they go to relatively sporadically in the regular season or maybe early on, because I think there is like the other aspect, and I'm curious to hear both of you's points on this. Like, you have Randle coming off a shoulder injury, you do have Anunoby, who does have a history of injuries. Like, is there a level of maybe not going to that as much early because you want to just have a healthy 20 games or so, allow both of these guys to maybe be a little more, I feel more comfortable they can handle the wear and tear, and hold this to be more of the priority come late in the season or playoffs? I think that is a reasonable discussion based on maybe you're giving up a little bit high end in the regular season for this to be something you can really go to and have a healthy roster in the playoffs to really dive into that and utilize that small ball lineup in those games versus using it in November against the Hornets. So I think there's maybe a discussion on that. What do you guys think about, like, when do you just go to it because it's your best lineup and that you should play 20 minutes a night every night with that lineup? Or do you think there's some strategic pulling off the gas pedal a little bit based on like injuries and just like not wear and tear and such?
So my answer would be, and I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think XJ and I sometimes will get accused of just being like, you have this bias towards small ball. Like, you're always just going to lean towards small ball because that's your intuition. But I think XJ and I, and XJ, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the only bias we really have is towards what we think is best for a team's chance of winning. And so when we bring stuff like this up for the Knicks, it's not because, we like the aesthetics of a small lineup or we're obsessed with shooting. It's all what correlates with giving their team the best chance of winning at the highest level. And so
can I ask you a question based on that? Like, when they had, when it was Randle and RJ, and let's say RJ at the 4, Randle at the 5, were you less inclined to maybe dive into a small ball lineup that had that alignment versus what the Knicks could potentially have now?
I was interested in it with Obi. I wasn't sure it would work, but I just thought it was the best way to get Obi the minutes I thought he deserved, especially in 21-22. I realized they had trade-offs. I think it would have been a bad defensive lineup. I just think at that point in the season, the back half of the season, the Knicks didn't really have legitimate title equity. I wasn't asking them to tank. I just think it was their best chance of seeing what the long-term ceiling of that unit of players was. So that would have been my argument then. But to reel it back in, I think that when I say our bias is towards what correlates with winning, to make an extreme example, like if the Knicks had Jokic and Embiid as their centers, like, I'm not going to be here like, they also have to mix in a small lineup. Okay, no, they have 2 of the top 5 players at center. You just play them all the time. And even when it was Mitch and Hartenstein, I on some level understood why they just wanted 48 minutes of center. So to start this season, I think the answer is it depends. And what it depends on is how healthy Mitch is, to be specific. Because if Mitch starts the season and you have Precious as the backup center, I could totally see your perspective as reasonable, the perspective you just brought up, in the sense of Randall's coming off an injury. OG Anunoby, like you said, is not a beacon of health. They want to see this, if those two can play at the 4 and the 5, but maybe just don't jump into it. Let Mitch and Precious take the center minutes. Don't just go right into it. With that being said, I think you still need to have it in the bag. And I personally, it's my personal belief, I don't think you can just pull something like that out in the playoffs. Like, I don't think you can just say, we played an entire season this way, but we're just going to try it in the playoffs if it becomes necessary. I think you need repetition. I think you need to build chemistry. I always go back to those 2021 playoffs. All season long, anybody who looked at the data said, why is Elfrid Payton starting for this team? This guy was one of the worst players in the NBA, and people just kept defending it over and over again. They say, we're winning, we're meeting or exceeding expectations. And it's like, but they're exceeding expectations in spite of this. They're going to make the playoffs, and they're just not going to be prepared to take a punch. They're not going to be prepared to adjust. And then Payton's awful in the first 2 playoff games, and Tibbs moves him to the bench, and they have no backup plan. And their backup plan is Derrick Rose can play 44 minutes a game. And so I guess my conclusion is that while the point you brought up does have merit, I think that at some point you have to ease it in the regular season, both to raise your regular season ceiling and to have it in the bag in the postseason when it will be necessary. Because I think it will be necessary in the playoffs.
Yeah. And I'll turn over to XJ. I do agree with you that you got to lean into it some in the regular season. The question would be like when and how often, which is an almost impossible question to sort of prognosticate. But I think it is something you do need to have reps in if it's going to be an effective playoff lineup. So I agree there.
I'm on record with the Knicks this season. Everything is about winning a title because they have the squad to do it. I know, DJ, you definitely agree with that. Geoff and I have talked about this. So to me, the answer is, which is not a real answer because like you said, it's hard to identify that. You play it as enough as it prepares you for success with it in the playoffs and not more than that. Of course, you can't perfectly identify what that point is going to be. But that's your goal. Your goal is to know how it works, for the players to feel comfortable with it, for them to know. And I think there's a learning curve to it because who's protecting the rim? This is going to be somebody who's not used to being the last line of defense and rim deterrence on a possession by possession basis. And so, there's just a lot to kind of work through. And so I think for that reason, you have to see it. But I don't care to see it for regular season success. That would not be my goal in playing it. Let's try to win as many games as possible by playing our best lineup. I don't really care about that personally. I care about setting them up for maximal success in the playoffs. And so I think it's a great point to bring up, to really be clear about why are we playing this lineup? And if we're playing it a lot, why are we playing it a lot? If we're playing it a little, why are we playing it a little? So I think it's critical. And yeah, if anybody wants to jump in, because I want to make a hard transition. So if anybody wants to say any last words on this topic.
I just want to say that the final thing you said about whether it maximizes your chances of winning every regular season game versus maximizing your season-long goals is such an important distinction, and it's so relevant to the Knicks and a couple other teams, honestly. Like, you would have said the same thing about Mike Malone in Denver. You would have said the same thing about Budenholzer in Milwaukee before he got fired. There are these coaches that, in my opinion, are so single-minded and trying to maximize each minute. And that has positive trade-offs, but you do reach a point where a team is beyond that, in my opinion. And I do think the Knicks are, if they weren't beyond it last season, I think they're definitely beyond it. That doesn't mean they shouldn't play Tom Thibodeau basketball. That doesn't mean they shouldn't try to, try their best. They shouldn't try to win. I think most fans and the players appreciate that Tibbs asked that of them. But there is a middle ground in terms of making sure that you're ready to peak when the playoffs come, both schematically and with your players being as healthy as possible. And we'll see how that goes this season.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on it, and I think that you can summarize this discussion with, this is the most important, in my opinion. I think I got pushed back on Twitter when I said this, but I think this is the most important year of Tom Thibodeau's career. I think it's by far, in terms of just talent, even over some of those Chicago teams, I think it's the most talented roster he's had, the most versatile roster he's had. He has to have a great coaching year. And that, I know that can be a little bit challenging to sort of judge, but we'll know it when we see it. If we see this, him not leading into the things we're talking about, then, and he's trying to maximize every possession, like Geoff, you're saying, then we can have a little bit of skepticism. I think some skepticism going into the year is fair, because I don't think he has not shown yet that he's got the ability to elevate a team to a championship level, but he hasn't had this level of talent. So it's all this to say he's got to come through this year. So it's a big year for Tom Thibodeau. He has a lot of pieces to sort of be versatile, and he's got to lean into that. It's a big year for him.
If you're listening to this and you appreciate substantive basketball conversations, we got DJ here, one of the best film analysts in the business, to try to break things down really deeply, as we always do. We love having substantive conversations here about the game of basketball. Why not take 1 second to subscribe now? Leave a comment, leave a like, do whatever you can to kind of support these conversations, and we'll continue to have them all throughout the summer and upcoming years. In the meantime, we have been talking about coaching. We've been talking about strategy, a place where we may have some fireworks here. It was all well and good. We're all agreeing, DJ. We're all on the same page here. Let's go to a place where we've disagreed, maybe the most. And I'm not going to characterize your perspective, DJ. I'm just going to kind of lay it out. We've talked about the value of shooting and spacing, and the spacing and gravity that comes specifically from being competent, capable 3-point shooter, versus the value of size and physicality. In my opinion, the space that's created specifically by the threat of shooting is the number one most important factor in effective offense in basketball. And because of how skilled modern NBA players are, help defense is more necessary than ever. You're not guarding guys like Jalen Brunson and Luka Doncic one-on-one. It's just not happening. You're just going to get destroyed if you try to do that. You need help. Obviously, space can be created in a number of different ways. There's no denying that. But there's, in my opinion, a difference between creating space through movement and action and generating space purely by existing on the court. And to me, the latter is more consistent. It affects more possessions. It's like a relentless, grading pressure that exists at all times on the defense, whether guys are tired or fresh, or they're well coordinated, or they're in disarray, or they can't run around, they can't set screens, or they can. It's always there. And the biggest example of this dichotomy, in my opinion, between spacing and physicality is the debate. I wouldn't say it's a debate, but some of the lineups that we've seen where Precious plays the 4 for the Knicks, with Randle and OG Anunoby out. Obviously, it's a big caveat. 2 of the Knicks' best players are out, probably their second and third best players. There was a question of whether Precious should start at the 4 or Deuce McBride should start at the 2. Precious would make the Knicks big and physical with Brunson, DiVincenzo, Hart, Precious, Hartenstein. That's a big and physical lineup. Deuce would make the Knicks one of the smallest starting lineups featured in the entire season, with DiVincenzo and Hart each moving up a spot, and Deuce making the Knicks' average backcourt height about 6'1". And to me, the trade-off is clear. I'd rather have the shooting, and it helps that Deuce McBride is an excellent on-ball defender and point-of-attack defender to kind of complement Jalen Brunson in the backcourt. I think this is a big discussion, and I'd love for you to clarify kind of your perspective on it, DJ, and then go with what you think, anything you would want to explain about this kind of dichotomy, whether you think it's a true dichotomy or not, or whatever your perspective is. I'd love to hear that from you.
Sure. Yeah. And I think it can be a dichotomy. And I will say, just off the jump, I think shooting is the most important skill in basketball. I don't think there's any qualms about that. There isn't a debate. It's the most, if you're going to be great at one thing on an NBA court, if you're a great shooter and you have requisite, other, you're at least a D on everything else, there's still a value to what you can bring as a basketball player. So I would agree with you that shooting is the most important thing. I think for the Knicks, the example if we're going to use them as the example, and whether or not Precious was the right decision to play at the 4 versus a smaller backcourt with Deuce McBride, I think if there was another coach, I would have more confidence that that would have been going to a smaller lineup would have made more sense. But it felt like part of my thought process was, I know how this coach wants to play. I know the lack of ability there was to have any sort of practice time. It's your post All-Star. There's not a lot to do in terms of if you're going to have a change of that level. I think there is something to be said about all right, are you able to implement some of the strategies that are going to take advantage of this level of shooting that you would have on the court? Because I think where I differ a little bit is you can have great shooters, but if you don't have, I think, 2 guys on a court to get 2 to the ball, and most elite teams have 2 of them, I think you are maybe not going to take full advantage of that shooting, because if you're not getting 2 to the ball, you're not creating those odd advantages, then how often are you taking advantage of that legitimate spacing, which I cannot argue against, that it is there. If you watch the minutes, and actually you and I have talked specifically about this aspect, when you have Precious in the corner, even on the strong side corner, you saw teams eventually start to leave him there and play off, help stunt off that strong side, which is not typically what is done in the NBA, because most shooters in the corner can at least, 35% is a low end in terms of an average shooter from the corner. So you don't want to help off that side. Teams were doing that against Precious. There were things the Knicks tried to do to sort of weaponize the fact that he wasn't guarded. And that's And there's certain things I think the Knicks can get better at. Like there's a whole concept of like playing uphill versus downhill. Like if you're going to have a guy unguarded in the corner and he catches that ball, and you can play uphill into a DHO and without a lot of like available help, because that big is likely going to be in the paint, you can get some open shots. If you could really get that screen on that offensive player who's receiving that ball, if you get a good, you can really screen him, you can get an open shot. And the Knicks did that a lot with DiVincenzo last year. So there are ways to sort of mitigate that, but there's no, the Knicks, when they were going well with Precious, were not a dynamite offensive team. Like they struggled even in the game 4 against Philadelphia, which to me was like the apex of the Precious at the 4, Anunoby at the 5. Like you had this lack of, poor shooting, but great defense. Like they held the Sixers in check, but also couldn't score on the other end. I mean, that's been lost a little bit when we talk about how that game 4 ended. The Knicks could not get a bucket with after we hit the 5-minute mark. So I think there is a lot to be said about that. I just wonder, if you're going to have you're going to really lean into the smaller shooting lineup. I question Deuce as a defender against bigger guards, wings. Forget it. I just think he's been underwhelming as a Knick, in my perspective, guarding the ball when it's a non-point guard. So I do think that I don't think he's as good as Quickly, and I don't think Quickly was elite guarding bigger players. And I think Quickly was actually better than Deuce guarding up the lineup. I think Deuce is really great against point guards, sub 6'5". I think he really struggles when he has guys that are a little bit bigger. So it's an interesting discussion. I get where you're coming from, and I can understand the point of leaning into the shooting. But to me, I thought where the coach was and the ability to maybe adjust on the fly, which is what you were doing in that point in the year. I understood and was a proponent of getting Precious those minutes at the 4, even acknowledging the real legitimate spacing constraints that his presence is going to provide, especially playing with a Hartenstein or Sims. It's just a lot of non-spacers on the floor. And it's really hard to have a competent offense in this day and age with those players playing. But you can sell me on the Deuce idea. You could sell me on going small and going with as we talked about in the previous segment, of leading into a more offensively centric roster. I think it's very fair. And that you had a good point about Deuce last year. I just wouldn't go to it because I feared how Deuce would guard up. And I thought leaning into what the coach wants made sense in that specific time period where you had the injuries. You just had to figure out a way to grind games out. That excuse is now gone with the talent and with the healthy bodies you're hoping to get coming into this next season.
And to sort of steelman your perspective about Deuce, even though I think I probably believe in his ability to guard up a little bit more than you, okay. But as it relates to Quickly, as you brought up, if you view them similarly in terms of what they can do on ball versus slightly bigger players, Deuce isn't close to what Quickly he doesn't bring close to the impact that Quickly could bring off the ball. So you're more willing to live with the trade-offs of Quickly sometimes getting exploited by slightly bigger players if he's roaming as a free safety in all the possessions when he's not on the ball. Yep. I still honestly have PTSD about him getting pulled in that Thunder game because Jalen Williams hit a tough 16-footer over him when Quickly was definitely the best player in that game, and then he got traded 2 days later. That's
he was a sub for RJ, right? No, it was the RJ
sub for RJ in the game that he was probably the best Knicks player because Jalen Williams hit a tough fadeaway over him, and it was
tough moment for Tibbs. I get it. I'm usually like we said, I'm usually gonna lean into the bigger, more physical lineup, but that was a bad look by the head coach.
That was one of, in my opinion, obviously I'm biased because I love Quickly. That was one of John's funnier post game minutes. You don't really see John go off on Tibbs ever, and that was a moment when he was I'm not here to say someone made a bad call, but that was a bad call. I was hell yeah, John. But I do think, I think the Precious at power forward minutes, it's almost their own thing to me. I'm not saying it's not interesting, but they were so compromised with all these injuries that while I do think that I would disagree with the decision to play Precious at power forward, like shit, man. Like what are we even debating between here? A team with that could maybe reasonably consider Precious a power forward probably isn't winning at a high level anyways. So I know that isn't a good enough excuse. I just think that it becomes more interesting when you start making the stakes higher. So, XJ, if you have anything you'd like to comment on about specifically Precious versus Deuce at that position, hop in, or I'd like to toss a question right back to DJ.
No, go ahead. Toss a question.
So on this topic, DJ, I have my question to you is, which lineup this season do you think has a better chance at long-term success? The starting lineup of Brunson, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Julius Randle, or Mitchell Robinson, or the starting lineup with Dante DiVincenzo in Julius Randle's place? Because I think, honestly, I think that is the conversation that really points to all the things you're talking about. It covers the Knicks having one creator versus two creators. They get smaller, but they add in some more shooting. I think if we can discuss those two lineups and try to figure out what the trade-offs are and which lineup might be better over the totality of a season, I think we can really start to get to some of the themes that we're trying to talk about here.
Yeah, it'll be a good jumping off point. I mentioned having the need for two. It's not necessarily two initiators, but just two guys that are going to draw two to the ball, because when you start there, if you can you don't even have to be a quick decision maker, which Julius Randle will never be a quick decision maker. He's gotten better. He's not ever going to be a quick decision maker, but because his gravity on the ball is what it is, he can make C+ decisions in terms of the quickness and get the ball out and automatically putting the defense in rotation. It is automatically creating closeouts for guys like Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby that are adept at getting, whether it's, OG is more of getting a 2-foot pull up, but Mikal can get all the way to the basket consistently out of that. So to me, and that's not even considering the fact that your best catch and shoot player on the Knicks, other than DiVincenzo, and I think there's a debate here, I think the best non-DiVincenzo shooter is Jalen Brunson off the catch. And it's not just shooting the ball, it's because it's creating that closeout. And I don't think there's 5 guys in the NBA right now better at beating a closeout than Jalen Brunson. So to me, and this is going to get back to Randle and Brunson, where they are synergistic, where there's some maybe things that you would like to have you don't have, but the one thing that they are I can go into next season and I will know that Julius Randle drives, and especially Julius Randle post-ups, are going to create a reaction to get 2 or 3 to the ball, at least eyeballs on him. So that's part where Jalen Brunson's relocation along the perimeter gets really dangerous, because he's not your classic movement shooter, but he's very good at creating passing windows and finding the eyes of Randle and getting into those spots where he's not flying off a screen, but he's just moving enough to create open looks. Those two really started to develop great ability to play off each other in that way. And I think if you're going to prioritize Brunson being efficient, being at playing at a level where he's still scoring 24 to 26 a game, but he's getting easier shots, then I think you need to have that second initiator. And while I think Mikal Bridges showed with the Nets and with Phoenix at times that he has a little bit of that equity, I'm not comfortable saying that he can consistently get 2 to the ball and create those advantages. I don't think Dante's at that level. So if you want to talk about the lineup that is going to work long-term or be the better lineup, I'll lean the starters that we're going to see with Randle in there, because of based on, I think you'll get the best version of Jalen Brunson, maybe not the highest end, but you'll get the best version of him in terms of sustainability, efficiency, and then just the dynamism that he can play off an advantage. To me, you have to tap into that. Last year he was amazing doing what he did, but it never felt like it was a long-term success story. And eventually in the playoffs, he had great moments, but he also had some, I think, lower moments. And I think he would normally have if he had a little bit more help. And I think Randle does provide that. So I would still go with the Randle starting lineup in terms of what I think would be the most efficient lineup in terms of like net rating, but I do understand like how lethal a shooting lineup Dante in for Randle would be. It would be you would win a lot of games with that lineup. I think Randle's presence, I think, sustains that a little bit longer, and keeps your best player, I think, healthy and playing at his best. And I think that's Brunson.
I think that's a really, really fair perspective for sure. And you made a great case for it. I guess I think about it a little bit like, does Randle on the court make Brunson slightly worse? And even if he does, that doesn't mean that lineup would be worse. But what I mean by slightly worse is a kind of a side conversation is how much off-ball gravity does Julius Randle provide? If Julius Randle doesn't have the ball, what is the value that he's providing? And I think we've seen some of the data. You've shared this data from B-Ball Index before, DJ. Randle seems to have strong off-ball gravity. We can kind of quibble about like how they come up with that data and what it means, but It's not really important for the conversation, because to me, I think about things, and we talked about this earlier, we alluded to this earlier. It really is about what happens in the playoffs. In my opinion, in the playoffs, teams, coaches are not going to treat Randle with the same off-ball respect that they do in the regular season. I think in the regular season, you see Julius Randle, you guard Julius Randle. You don't say, there's Julius Randle, whatever, I'm going to just leave him open. That seems crazy. In the playoffs, when you're preparing for a team and you're saying, where are the weaknesses? Where can we scrape out, 1 point per 100 possessions more? You say, well, is Julius Randle going to kill us if he's, above the break on the wing and wide open? I mean, if he gets the ball and we have to close out, do we have to close out that hard so we can just give him a head of steam going to the basket? Or do we kind of welcome him to take those shots? Is he not going to take those shots? Is he going to throw away the advantage that's created by a guy like Jalen Brunson and say, hey, Jalen Brunson created this great advantage. Julius Randle got an open 10-foot open shot. And
record scratch.
And then is it just like, okay, well, let's just start over. Let's throw away that advantage and let's start over. Is that what's going to happen? And to me, that's the big question. And it could be the fact that what you're saying, just because Brunson is so much better off ball than other guys in the league and other guys that the Knicks have, it could be on the net, it's better for the Knicks. But I do think Randle's presence, especially in a playoff environment, would make Jalen Brunson worse. And that is a concern of mine in terms of longevity, sustainability. I kind of lean towards your side, but getting the Knicks to be at the highest level to hit their ceiling, I'm not sure where I land. And we're just talking about offense here. We're not talking about defense at all, which is another conversation in of itself.
It is another conversation, but I think you make a fantastic point, about the playoffs, because it is a different ball game, and we've seen teams not guard him in the same manner along the perimeter. So I think it's a open question whether Randle could effectively take advantage of those opportunities, because his 3-point percentage in the playoffs is what it is. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's got to be, if it's in the upper 20s, maybe low, I don't think it's in the low 30s. I don't think he's gotten quite there. Like, it's really bad. And I think there's every reason to believe. I thought Miami did it a little bit in the 22-23 playoff run, where they allowed him to catch, and they just were like, all right, you're either going to shoot this, or you're going to, like you said, XJ, just let the advantage deteriorate. So it's a fair, reasonable thought. I do, to go back to like the B-ball index stuff, I've never gotten the perspective, and at least in the regular season, that Julius Randle is left unguarded. I feel like there is and this goes back to maybe the idea of like, if you're a willing shooter and you have some success, teams are just going to guard you. And I think there is something with Julius that, and maybe it's just those two things that forces teams, or at least gives the impression that he is a better shooter than maybe some of the field goal percentage stuff will tell you, because he had a year where he took 8 threes roughly a game. And he was, the percentages weren't great, but he took tough catch and shoot, or tough pull-up threes, self-created looks. So maybe the percentage would have been a little higher if he was just catch and shoot or took more corner threes. So it's a good point regarding the playoffs. I will say, like, in the regular season, I would feel confident that the Randle lineup would be better. I think you make good points about the playoffs, and I would have a little bit more reservation, skepticism that the Randle lineup would be the better lineup, because I think if he's not making shots, teams are likely not going to pay as much attention to him as a post player as well, because I just think you'd have better defenders on him, and teams are just not going to give the Knicks those advantages in the playoffs. I think it's fair to say that those advantages you get in the regular season could dry up in the playoffs. So then you'd have to adjust, and maybe the better lineup is not a Randle a starting five or a 5-man lineup that plays the most. I think that's completely reasonable. I think in the regular season, and I'm one to, granted, I agree the Knicks do have championship equity and you have to prioritize the playoffs. I do really think, and this is maybe why like I do have so much regard for Tibbs. Like, I don't buy into like the notion. I'm not saying you guys are doing this at all, by the way. I think there is a notion out there that he should pay maybe a lot less attention to the regular season for the playoffs, which I think he should, as we talked about in a segment prior, he should lean into certain lineups that would have more playoff equity and potentially have those reps for the playoffs and use the regular season for those possessions because you'd want to be ready for the playoffs. I think that's completely fair. But I think if the Knicks are going to win a championship, I think they're going to have to win in the 50s. I think they're going to have a 1, 2, or 3 seed. I think there's going to be a need for this team to win a lot of ball games. Even with Porzingis being out, I think the Celtics are going to win in the 50s. I think the 76ers, I think they're going to win in the 50s if they get even decent health. So I think the Knicks have to be in the top 3 on a personal level to really push for a championship. But I think you make a good point about like how Randle is guarded in the playoffs versus the regular season. It's completely different. And it's not unique to him. There's a lot of players that are guarded differently because you can really hone in on where you can get advantages. So I think you didn't, I'm not saying you're swaying me. I'm saying like you make great points, both of you, that in the playoffs, it might not be a Julius Randle type deal in terms of like your best lineup. It could be a DiVincenzo or someone else because of like how they're guarding him. And if he's not making shots, it makes it tough.
I just want to add something to XJ's point for anyone out there who may be a new listener, who may not know the entirety of his perspective. It's really important to remember that we're speaking relatively here. Like, XJ isn't just saying that because Randle has these shortcomings, the Knicks would just be better off if they just lost him for nothing. Like, that's anyone out there who's trying to parlay what XJ is saying into that, just don't get those notions. This is actually like a really nuanced conversation, and the conversation is always the team is better with Julius Randle on the team. I think that's almost unquestionable. But is the whole, does the sum of its parts approach the whole? And I think that nuance is important because when you look at data like Randle and Brunson's offensive rating when they share the court together, and then Brunson's the team offensive rating when Brunson's without Randle, and you see it doesn't move, you start to question like, are we sure that the positives that Randle brings when he's sharing the court with Randle are worth, some of the other things you're trading off for? And I'm not, expressing a certainty in any way, but I do think it's at worst an interesting conversation because maybe there are lineups that the Knicks should lean on with Brunson on the court. Maybe they should stagger more. Maybe there are lineups that Randle would thrive in and be his best self in the minutes that Brunson doesn't play that the Knicks should lean in. These are all questions that a team looking to contend for a championship needs to ask, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I forget to say that. We need this disclaimer. The Knicks would unequivocally be worse if they just lost Randle for now. Like, that is not at all part of the argument. But I think it is this nuanced discussion that we're kind of having. And I love both the points that you both made. I do think there is a lot to what you were saying, DJ. And I do agree that teams treat Randle with respect. And I know for sure that Geoff believes that as well. I think Geoff is more kind of open to a reputational based, off-ball gravity based on
functional gravity.
Functional gravity. That's what.
Functional gravity. Actually, Pascal Siakam has it. It's like the most insane thing in the world to me that Pascal Siakam isn't just ignored on the perimeter.
Like a bad shooter.
I genuinely feel like it's like human intuition. They're like, oh, good player, former All-Star, have to close out. I just think it's a human reaction that these players do, and I think Julius Randle is just always on some level. Like, unless it's at the highest level being specifically game planned for, the coach is like, hey, leave him alone. I think a player's tendencies will always be to respect Randle maybe more than the numbers say you should.
Yep.
Well, the other, and this is where I think some of the tactical things that we talked about earlier come into play, because if you are not going to guard Randle, he is really good. Let's say you have Randle like in the left slot, you have a high ball screen with Brunson and Mitchell Robinson going to like the outer third right side. So Brunson's going to his right hand, so he can kind of pull up, and he's got some advantages there. Randle's on the left wing. If there's a blitz or there's a hard hedge, that ball goes to Randle immediately, and that Randle's defender has really sunk in to help on that Brunson pick and roll. He goes right into a DHO with whether it's DiVincenzo, it could be Anunoby, it could be Mikal Bridges, and if he's got the sort of non-respect, that player is playing off him, that is a wide open three almost every time, because Randle's really good at just getting enough contact on that DHO to give that player, whoever's coming off that from the corner, an open look. So I think there is other areas where, like, if you're going to leave Randle alone, you're not just gaining the advantage of having more help, you're also losing the advantage of like a very clear counter the Knicks have built into their offense for years now, which is like whether it was Grimes or DiVincenzo, or it's that player on the left wing coming around that Randle DHO has been a staple of this offense. And it's just one of the ways they can weaponize any space that Randle's been given. So there are other areas where the Knicks have these, I think it's more flow than anything, but these like things they built into their offense that can counter some of the ways defenses can try to muddy up the Brunson driving lanes and make life harder on him. So just wanted to point that out, that Knicks do have ways to mitigate some of the Randle spacing concerns if they were to be more of a problem come playoffs.
For sure. Definitely some of the Draymond Green stuff that we see, some of the, Sabonis stuff that we see with guys who are being played off on the perimeter. I think, we talked about a ton of things. We have a couple more topics we want to get to. This one seems most related because DJ, you mentioned the idea of having two guys that are going to draw two to the ball on the court. Something else that we wanted to talk about is something that I think we've spent a ton of time talking about here on the first season of Hot Hand Theory. And that's really putting a microscope on the value of primary initiation or primary creation, however you want to describe it. Whatever it is, that's the player with the ball in their hands, initiating action offensively to create scoring opportunities for their team. And that idea in relation to the value of more additive players or players who contribute to team success in ways that don't diminish the value of that primary initiators and more on-ball dominant players bring. First, I really want to, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this here. Maybe this is ambitious, but I want to try to define better what a role player is, because I think this could just be a semantical thing, but to me, role player always sounds sort of like belittling, or like, those players are implicitly less valuable. And along those lines, are primary initiators intrinsically more valuable than players we consider as role players? And the kind of last thing I want to say before throwing it to you, DJ, is there are guys who, I've referred to as kind of like off-ball stars for a few years. And I think that terminology should be part of the mainstream lexicon in making distinct that the fact that stars are not only the ones who, ostensibly create shots with the ball in their hands. You mentioned Lauri Markkanen earlier. Lauri Markkanen is clearly the biggest off-ball star in the league to me. He has an offensive impact in the mid 90th percentile across all of our best metrics, but still somehow has a usage below 90th percentile and assist percentage below 40th percentile. His average time of possession last year was 1.6 minutes per game, which is around 165th in the NBA if you include every player who plays over 15 minutes per game. He averages 1.84 seconds per touch, which is 240th in the league. I would argue that there's intrinsic value to that. Like the expected value of shots later in the shot clock are significantly lower than shots earlier in the shot clock. So, either shooting it or moving it quickly, if you're not charged with creating a shot off the dribble, is super valuable. And it also represents the fact that, like we were talking about a little bit earlier, Markkanen doesn't surrender advantages. He's not letting the defense catch up once the team has an advantage by slowing things down or being indecisive. And he, to me, is clearly a star, but he has the ball in his hands about the same amount of time as like Nick Claxton and Bojan Bogdanovic did last year. And he holds on to it when he has it about as long as Precious Achua and Haywood Highsmith. So to me, I just think, you know, just because Markkanen is the most obvious quote unquote off ball star doesn't mean he's the only one. So I don't know if people look at him as like a role player because he's not having the ball in his hands, kind of like creating shots, or people look at him as a star player. And is there a strict dichotomy there between, you know, stars have the ball and create shots, and role players receive the ball and finish possessions? You know, it's not clear to me, and I just want to get some clarification on some of that.
Yeah, well, defining a role player to the first part of your question, not easy. But if I was going to maybe sort of like boil it down to a sentence or two, it would be like a player, a non-initiator that specializes in like specific traits or skills to like really to help a team win. Now that is it could be that's a pretty broad definition, and I don't know if that necessarily, that might just have the pool of players that would fall into that is like, it's probably 95% of the players in the NBA, which might be fair, because there's some initiators that are so elite at those skills that maybe they would fall into that category based on that definition. But if you want to take take initiators out of the mix, I think just
we literally just saw Devin Booker do it in the Olympics. Like Devin Booker's an elite primary initiator, and he just scaled the hell down and said, "I'm just going to shoot open shots and play defense." So sorry to interrupt you, but that's
that was where I was going to go next, actually, in terms of like the second part of your question. XJ was like, are initiators intrinsically more valuable than like star role players or more like additive players? And I don't think they are intrinsically more valuable. I think there is an advantage potentially. I think this maybe gets overlooked a little bit in terms of like the value of being a lead initiator, but also having the ability to behave as a role player, sometimes like within a game, within a quarter, or season to season. We've seen, like, especially with like lead point guards that have been initiators, like it's very easy for them to sort of back into a role player role. Like Chris Paul was like a dynamic lead initiator, and then sort of like as his career progressed, initiated offense, but certainly not with the usage or like certain traits that would be more in line with like a true like star initiator. I think Drew Holiday his usage was very low last year compared to years past. So I think if you are a really dynamic lead initiator, and you are a good defensive player at like a guard position, you have a lot of equity to like play off ball, to be like a connective passer. So I think if you look at lead initiators and you think, all right, so there's probably like a threshold. I don't have the numbers like available, but like there's got to be like a threshold of like, if you're not hitting this number in terms of like half court offense based on like the plays or the possessions we're going to run for you, you're just not good enough to be that player. And maybe it would make more sense to run like a more Utah Jazz style offense, where it's not a lot of like just your standard high pick and roll, get an advantage, get two to the ball, kick out for a three. Like they're a very unique offense with how they use Lauri Markkanen, which speaks to, we talked about synergy, like, and how Randle, I think, found the right coach and he flourished under Thibodeau. Markkanen finding Hardy, and Hardy building an offense based on Markkanen's size and ability to shoot and his release point and all these things, the flare screening, the fact that Kessler is a really good screener, and the rim running of Collins, and like the way they build their offense, like it's really in lockstep with how Markkanen can really flourish clearly. So I guess to sum it up, I would say role players, they may have more specific skills to really like help a team. But I do think initiators, unless you're like a Cade Cunningham or like a young player, maybe trying to grow into that lead initiator role, and you're playing for a young team and you need a guy to sort of like innings eat. I think that could be something that happens, even though he's probably a little overwhelmed for the job based on like what Detroit has around him. But I think you can take a lead initiator and they could be like Jalen Brunson, where like, yeah, you're going to be our lead initiator for X amount of possessions, but also like you're like our second best off ball shooter. So like you can be a role player in certain aspects of the game. And really, if Randall's going or someone's, if Kevin Durant's really going well, Devin Booker could be the floor spacer and like connect a passer, close out, destroyer, like all those things. So I think having a lead initiator generally allows you to sort of back into a role-playing role. And that just, to me, makes your team more dangerous, more valuable, especially if you have like 2 or 3 guys that can create advantages. And then you can have a lot of versatility.
So an example I think we being the collective, almost all NBA fans have an intuitive bias towards initiators versus quote unquote role players. And I think that bias stems from an inherent implication that initiation is harder, so therefore it is better. If you were drafting players to play a pickup game, you would take the best players. So the guys.
Do you think it's hard? Do you think it's harder generally? Do you think it's like? What do you think it's like? One of the, if you had to like say like, how is initiating an offense like one and doing it well, and not just like running, be your nominal point guard, just getting yourself into like a set, like actually creating the advantage and being like a dynamic like fulcrum of an offense. Is that like to me or to you, is that the hardest? Like if you're like a skill,
I think it is the highest degree of difficulty thing there is in the NBA. If I had to, given the 10 seconds I've had to think about it, I think it's the highest degree of difficulty thing. What I will say though is I think it's different, but I think it's almost as hard for a low usage guy to maintain efficiency. I think that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. We've seen it with the Knicks the last couple seasons. You look at Obi Toppin. The fans love to talk about how inconsistent he was as a shooter off the bench. Talk about OG Anunoby, who basically has no usage unless he's shooting or attacking a closeout. I think the ability to go multiple minutes without your hands on the ball and stay fresh, stay in rhythm is in a different way very hard to do as well. I don't think the degree of difficulty is as hard as the skills required to initiate offense, but I do want to point out that there is a level of difficulty to staying in rhythm and staying consistent as a shooter without consistent touches. DJ, I'm sure you know that. Like you're a high-level basketball player. I'm sure you shoot 100 free throws, you're going to be better on the 90th free throw. You're going to be more in rhythm than if you shot, 1 free throw every week. For example, you go. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Give me your example.
But the example I always use related to primacy versus role players, I always think back to like Tyreek Evans versus Danny Green. I don't know why I always lean on this. This is always my go-to example because I think everybody who watched these two players, their intuitive bias would be to say, well, Tyreek Evans was a better basketball player. He could do all these things that Danny Green couldn't do, but Tyreek Evans couldn't lead an offense at a high enough level to leverage the things he could do better than Danny Green. So even though he was quote unquote better at basketball, I'm not sure there's a good team in their era that would have preferred to have Tyreek Evans over Danny Green. I think Danny Green gets taken by just about every playoff team. And so I guess my point there is that this is a really, really difficult discussion. And I thought you nailed it when you talked about scalability, when you talked about the ability of a Jalen Brunson type to lead an offense, but not always have the ball in his hands and say, okay, Julius Randle, you want to run the offense. I'm going to help the team with my off-ball gravity. I'm a really good catch and shooter. I can move off the ball. I think more than anything, scalability has become the most important thing of a player in the NBA. And I think it's superseded or it's surpassed primary initiation. In my opinion, there are really only a handful of guys who can be unequivocal primary initiators. I think a Luka Doncic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Nikola Jokic, these guys are guys where whoever they're on the team with, you pretty much want the offense to run through them and you want them to be their best selves.
Who's like the worst? Who's the worst player that would fall into that category for you? Like who's the bottom of the list? Is like Donovan Mitchell? Like would you consider him to be like?
I think I'd go higher. I think if Mitchell was if Mitchell was a pure helio player who was not scalable at all, whose shooting didn't help the team, I think he'd be a lot worse from a team impact standpoint. I think his shooting helps a lot, even though he does love the ball in his hands. I think that, I think if he was like more like a Westbrook type, like where you took his shooting away. I know that's an absurd example because it's like, you take a good shooter's shooting away, then what are they? But my point is that even someone like Mitchell, who loves having the ball in his hands, I think his impact is helped a lot by his ability to play off ball. I gotta be honest, I'd go higher. I'd go like maybe even above Brunson. I think if Brunson was a more helio player, it would be questionable as to whether what you could do with him on your team trying to unless you built the team to perfectly maximize him. And I'm not sure where the ceiling is. I know that's going to be an unpopular opinion. I just think, and to be clear, I think Brunson is scalable. So I think they can win a championship with him. It's not a concern. Go
ahead. I'm sorry.
I just want to finish up and say that, when I say scalability, I just mean guys who can bring some semblance of impact when the ball isn't in their hands, and they can scale their role down and still help the team. And I think that pretty much unless you're one of a couple of guys, if you're not scalable, you can't really be your best self sharing the court with other players who are good enough to win a championship with. I think the league is so talented and so smart. I just think it's really hard to win that way. I'm not going to say impossible, but yeah.
That's fair. And I agree that, the talent in the league right now is like, it's never been better. And it continues to get better with the skill development and all that. So I definitely agree with that. That last point is really important to say. I do want to just ask for clarification. When you guys talk about a primary initiator and then like helio ball, are they one and the same, synonymous, or is there like, can you be a primary initiator and have like a lower threshold for that versus like helio ball? Like, is there like, do you separate the two? I don't know if we might be getting into the weeds of like semantics, but do you view those things as inherently like different? Like helio?
Yeah, I think they're definitely different. I think like Halliburton and Luka are closer to helio ball. I think prime James Harden. But like, take a look at somebody like LeBron James. I think LeBron has had multiple phases in his career where he was a heliocentric offensive player, where he basically carried the entire burden. But I think some of the best years of his career were when he actually scaled down and he improved his shooting. Shot 40% from three in Miami in 2013. Those 2016, 2017 Cavs teams are probably the best teams he's ever been on besides that 2013 Heat team. And Kyrie Irving had maybe the two best seasons of his entire career. And him and LeBron were extremely interactive in their impact. It wasn't just run everything through LeBron. So no, I don't think that they're I don't think you have to be helio to be a primary initiator. I think there are plenty of primary initiators who are scalable. And we talked about Devin Booker. I think he's one. I think Mitchell's one. Honestly, it's really hard to find, like, it's because this depth of talent is so wide. You really have to get to guys like Ja Morant, De'Aaron Fox, where you start to wonder, like, okay, like, is there shooting enough for them to be? And I love those guys as players, but that's where it starts to get a little bit dicier to me.
I actually, to answer your first question, I agree with Geoff on the heliocentric aspect of the distinction there. I disagree on where the bar is, and I'll say why in a second. But I think that the hardest singular thing to do in basketball is the primary initiation job. So I think that is the hardest thing to do. I don't think the package is harder. So I think it's harder to initiate for sure, but is it harder to initiate than to, stay in rhythm without getting many shots, make your smaller proportion of shots, play great on ball and off ball defense? All of those things that you'll do in lieu of being a primary initiator. To me, that's what you're comparing. You're comparing one package to another, not one skill to another. So initiating much harder to me than making shots off ball. I think that. But I'm looking at the package, and for me, my bar is much lower than Geoff. Like, I think Trae Young is good enough. I think Donovan Mitchell is good enough as a primary initiator, even to be a heliocentric player, to not offer off-ball value or very much off-ball value. The thing about it is you can't be with a second creator then. You have to be the only creator. And You have to be a solo creator. And that's because you're not adding value off ball. You have to effectively be a specialist. Everything has to run through you. You have to be consistently maximized as the primary initiator, as the heliocentric player. Otherwise, you're just diminishing the performance of your team by being on the court when you don't have the ball in your hands. I do think that you can have one creator if you have one of those guys. And I think it's really interesting. This is just one data point. It's not like super end all be all, but of the top 5 offenses, 5-man lineups last year that played over 300 possessions, only one of them had what I would consider 2 creators at the same time on the court, because the top 5 was, Philadelphia number 1 with Maxey and Embiid on the court. But then number 2 was the Knicks with Brunson, the Brunson, McBride, DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, Isaiah Hartenstein lineup. That was number 2. Number 3 was Donovan Mitchell with, Max Strus, Okoro, Dean Wade, and Jared Allen. Number 4 was Indiana before they made the Siakam trade. Halliburton, Buddy Hield, Bruce Brown, Obi Toppin, and Miles Turner. And number 5 was Golden State, with their lineup of Curry, Thompson, Wiggins, Kuminga, and Draymond Green. And that's the top 5. And so I would say, in those lineups, typically pretty much you have one primary guy who's creating all the offense. You could argue Golden State because of how they run their offense is a little different, but talking about Halliburton, Brunson, and Mitchell, those guys are heliocentric players in those lineups. And I think it works. You just can't put another primary guy next to them, because then, you could do it with Brunson and Mitchell. I'm saying if they didn't have off-ball value, it wouldn't work anymore, because like you made the case, DJ, Brunson has a ton of off-ball value. He's one of the best at attacking closeouts in the entire league. And so that's why you can put him off ball and you can get a lot out of Julius Randle. You couldn't do that with a guy like Trae Young, and we saw that not work. But I think it could still work if that's all he does, basically. So I think that's where I differ.
Yeah. This is why a guy like Paul George, or to a lesser degree, a guy like Lauri Markkanen, these guys are so valuable, because it kind of blends the 2 perspectives together. Like if you put Paul George in Julius Randle's spot, I think, DJ, you'd agree that Paul George would bring enough secondary initiation. I don't think he forces the collapses Randle does, but I think you'd agree that he approximates it well enough that all the other advantages he brings would put them over the top. And so you get Brunson being the almost helio guy that XJ wants him to be. You get him the best version of himself, but then you also kind of marry that with, okay, like we do have a second guy to create collapses, and he's an elite shooter. He's a really good defender. Philly's scary, man. Like that, I guess that's what I'm going with that. Like Paul George is really good. And I think that more than anything, it highlights that this is really, really complicated shit. Like this is not solved. It's not baseball. This isn't a known product at all. This is constantly evolving information. And when XJ and I hopped on here, we were just like, this is such an interesting sport because it just is constantly evolving. This conversation really shines a light on it, I think.
Yeah, and it's just the synergy that you guys have talked about, whether a player is additive or not, how they react on the court until you see it, you don't really know. And I would be shocked if the Philly, that big 3, I'd be shocked unless there's like an injury or like a really like decline in Paul George's ability, which could happen, I guess, at his age. But assuming he has a natural decline curve, I'd be shocked if they don't just dynamite to handle and just really hard to guard. I think there might be a little, because Paul George loves to operate like at the right elbow, and maybe there's like spacing wise, like how could you have some potential concerns of like that mid post area with Embiid, but it's such a minor concern that what he provides defensively and his versatility, his off ball shooting, his on ball ability, like he would be like peak Paul George, like even last, not even peak, because the OKC version of Paul George was peak, and that was one of the best players of all time. But if last year's Paul George would be like the perfect player to be in that Randle spot where you'd get, as you said, Geoff, like the approximation of like the Randle gravity, but like all these other skill sets, the defense, like the quick decision making, the connected passing, like all those things that Paul George is really good at, the transition ability. far out supersedes like if you're going to give up a little bit for like his on ball gravity compared to Randle. So yeah, that would be like the type of guy. Now I would say, and maybe we would have a little disagreement here, is that I don't know if Markkanen, like if you swap Markkanen for Randle tomorrow, like I'd feel better about the Knicks because I just don't know. I think and I talked about this earlier, like the Jazz have built an offense to really take advantage of like Markkanen's skills. And I feel like if you put Markkanen with the Knicks, he's good enough to where like he'd be an awesome offensive player. I just don't know if he would be good enough as an on-ball threat. And here's where I put more onus on that aspect than maybe you guys do, because I think it's important, or a little bit more important. I don't know if he would be that sort of gravitational force to make up for what you're losing with Randle. It's close because Markkanen is not just a standstill shooter. Like he is a really good straight line driver. I think he's better defensively than he gets credit for. I think he's probably a little better than Randle. His size, he's more agile, he's bigger. So I think there's certain things you gain with Markkanen. I really think Julius's on ball ability is just that important for this Knicks roster. And I don't know if Markkanen, regardless of like the overwhelming advantage he has as a shooter, would make me feel better about where the Knicks are, because I just don't know if schematically the Knicks would be in any position to really take advantage of his off-ball movement and his shooting ability. So that's where like it's very complicated, is what you're saying.
Yeah, this goes back to the first conversation we were having, because I think you're 100% right. Like I think that if Lauri Markkanen got traded for Julius Randle, I don't think the Knicks would maximize him. I don't think they would. I think they would ask him to be the Julius Randle type, and he's good enough that he would maybe surpass what Randle does, maybe be only a little bit worse. It would be in that range, but it definitely wouldn't be the level of impact we've seen in Utah, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think these are strong points. I'm not sure, honestly, because I think this is compelling what you're saying and potentially the case. I would say one thing that I think they would have an advantage at is you would feel totally comfortable playing a 4-5 of OG and Lauri Markkanen, I think, much more than you would a OG and Julius Randle. And, Markkanen can offer some rim protection. He's nearly a true 7-footer and has played the center for a lot of his career. So that is one advantage you could have. But I think you also are losing some because you're not playing him the same way and maximizing what he does. And so, it makes it an open question to me.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if we are going to touch on like the eye test versus like analytics.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you have time to I know we're kind of running low. So if you don't have time, it's all good. We can wrap it there.
No, I got a few more minutes because I think it's an important discussion, because I think it speaks to how important is like the earlier stuff that we talked about like principles and putting players in the right positions and like how the team context of like the players that are around them. Because I think where like the eye test is more valuable versus analytics. And as you guys know, like I am not one to say analytics doesn't have a place. I think it's extremely valuable. Like many times, like I'll see something on the court, like actually visually see it, and I will need to like sort of validate it with some of the really good impact metrics that we have and other data that's available. But I will say, like, especially with like young players, to me, it's very hard. And I know like some of the impact metrics are trying to counter this, or at least consider it, is when you have like a coach that's maybe not maximizing you and a set of teammates that really doesn't allow you to flourish. And you don't have like a good historical data set in multiple scenarios and multiple team contexts. I think it could be more valuable in those occasions, if you at times, and I won't say this for every time, at times to maybe lean more like visually. What am I seeing? Am I seeing certain things that could be, if you put this player on another roster with a better coach, with a system that's going to take advantage of that player's skills, like would you get better performance than better impact metrics and some of the other things? So like, I guess I would send it back to you guys in terms of like, when would you say, all right, the eye test, it's flawed. I agree it's flawed, but when are there occasions where like maybe we can lean into it a little more, and maybe this in this specific scenario, does it have more value than it typically would or would in most cases?
Yep, Geoff.
I think the example you gave is perfect. Like, I think that is a spot where, because the situation you described, you're not trying to analyze what their impact was or project what their impact will be in the same situation or in a similar situation. You're trying to remove them from their context and place them in an entirely different one. So it's really hard for any stats to even try to project that. It's as flawed as it is, it's probably easier for a skilled person to rewatch the game and see like what they do well in their opinion when they watch, and what situation would be better for them. I think that's a situation where the eyes might supersede the data. One thing I want to say is that I think the thing that bothers me most about the eye test in general is that I think the eye test crowd often misses that there is a lot more going on the court than the direct action. And so if you think about like any conversation if you think about any conversation that pretty much comes down to like data versus eye test, like Kobe versus LeBron as scorers, for example, or, Damian Lillard versus Steph Curry as 3-point shooters. That was a popular one for a few years. Emmanuel Quickly's defense, all these things, as that relates to the Knicks. There are so many examples. Paolo Banchero versus Franz Wagner, all these things. The eye test crowd is always hyper-focused on the direct action. So, in the Paolo versus Franz conversation, it's just like, oh, well, who does what with the ball in their hands? Mm-hmm. But there's so much going on independent of the direct action that's being talked about in all these examples. And these are things that it's just almost impossible to cover for just by watching. You need data that tries to approximate the impact of those actions, of quickly relocating to the top of the key because he's really good at mapping the floor and knowing when there's an overload. These things that you might not pay attention to because the ball is in Julius Randle's hands and you're waiting for Julius Randle to go to work. These are areas that people who watch the game, not only do I think that they can't be tracking them well, I don't think that they even care to track them. I think there's a strong correlation, and I'm not including you in this, I know you don't think like this, but I think there's a strong correlation between people who would say, I don't need data, I have my eyes, and people who pretty much think the only things that matter is what's happening when the ball is in a player's hands. Or when it comes defensively, what happens when a guy is guarding a person with the ball in his hands. And I think where data really succeeds in a way that the eye test doesn't is covering that, is trying to be like, okay, what are we missing? What are areas of impact that don't have anything to do with the ball in their hands? So I do agree with you that there are certain areas where it's like, okay, this data doesn't even have anything to do with this. Why would we use it? I'm just going to try and like watch and see what's going on there. I think in the greater eye test versus impact metrics, that's where I lie. And that's where my frustration lies, because I see it all the time in these conversations. I don't see these people even acknowledging that there are things going on outside of the direct action.
I want to jump in real quick just before we get too far away from it. We didn't really like define our terms here. And in my opinion, the example that you gave, DJ, about trying to assess how a player would fit into a different context and how he'd perform and how he could be maximized, to me, I'd characterize that as film study. I wouldn't consider that the eye test. And I make a huge distinction between film study and the eye test. The eye test to me is just watching the game and having a takeaway assessment based on your, casual viewing of a basketball game. Now, what you're talking about, going back over film, studying how a player is utilized in the offense, seeing how they play off the ball, seeing how they play on the ball, the way that they're utilized, what their skills are, imagining that, being shifted over into the context of the dynamic of a new team and the ways that they like to run offense, how many sets they run, whether they're running more of like a flow style offense, like all of these different factors. That's film study to me. Film study will always be necessary, an integral part of analyzing basketball. Like, you will never get away from that no matter how much data you get. The eye test is a different thing to me. The eye test is, I'm watching a game. Hey, I've watched 82 Jazz games and I've watched 82 Knicks games, and I know this based on that observation. To me, that's the distinction, and that is too subject to some of what Geoff was talking about. You know, that's a literal physical limitation. You can't consciously process everything that we see. You know, subject to confirmation bias, faulty memories, and it's purely intuitive, really, when you think about it. That's a purely intuitive approach. And, you know, Ben Taylor from Thinking Basketball, he's also, you know, an amazing basketball analyst, but also a cognitive scientist, similar to my career field in behavioral science. He says that the brain is constantly making confident best guesses while masquerading them as absolute truth. And I think it's such a perfect quote, because that's what happens. We can see things, and then we're kind of just intuitively coming up with like our best guess at what happens, and we feel confident about it. And then we assume that that is reality, that is true. And that is the flaw of the eye test, of just watching games and coming up with broad takeaways. When you go back and study film, I think you can be a lot more concrete about what you think the takeaways are. And so to me, that's a fundamentally different approach.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. And I can use an example personally, because I've done a decent amount of the KFS post-game shows, and you were literally watching, and then you're within 2 minutes you're on. I find that very, very challenging for me as someone who does film study as like what I love to do, to be able to watch. Because when I'm watching a game, I can even if I'm like taking notes and like trying to look at it, I am watching the ball, because it's an entertainment product for me first. Like, I'm not going to like ever make this like my job to where like, all right, I'm just going to watch Franz Wagner's cutting today. That's all I'm focusing on. I could do that in a film study, because I can isolate and I can just like really break that down, or just pull like all his cuts and like, but if I'm just watching a game the first time, like I can have like an idea of like how things came out, but I would never, and I would challenge, I think you're right, XJ, and to say like no one can really have maybe you could be a savant and have this ability. I'm sure there's some out there that can, to see enough to have a really valuable takeaway, other than like the vibes of the game, or like the emotional stuff, or like top, you know, how a player scored, or like maybe like certain adjustments. Like there was a game against with the Clippers last year in November where like Julius Randle was really struggling, and they were like 6 or 7 games in, and Tibbs was like, all right, we're just going to like lean into Julius, like handling the ball in pick and roll scenarios, and like try to get him downhill. That was a very distinct strategic change that I was doing the watch party for KFS and saw immediately. And it was something that was very easy to diagnose, but like the minutia of the actual game, you have to, if you only knew how much time it takes me to do like these film sessions for these film breakdowns, like I'm watching things over and over again and isolating and rewinding and fast forwarding. And it is a grind, and you have to do it that way. To me, if you're really going to have a valuable, worthwhile, strong opinion on very specific instances that happen in a basketball game, you can't do it watching one time through. I don't. Maybe some can. The great majority cannot. So in that regard, if that is what your definition of the eye test is, analytics 99 times out of 100 would be the more valuable takeaway. Now, I will just say before I turn it back, to me, I enjoy the X's and O stuff. I enjoy like the skill discussions more than the analytics, and just on a personal level. So I always try to like remind myself of like, what are we doing? We're talking about a sport that we all love. And my feeling on that, my enjoyment is just greater when I'm leaning into that aspect of the game, regardless of the idea that I might not have as much data or information to make a point or have like an opinion. I just enjoy that part of the analysis more, which I think for anyone, when we have these discussions, we have to just keep in mind, like, we're not like debating like serious, like, you know, political topics that are going to like have game changing things for society or like civilization. Like we're talking about basketball. So like lean into like what's fun for you, because I think that is like what I try to like remind myself about, because we all have different enjoyments. We all love the whole aspect of basketball, but sometimes like we have things we like to lean in on a little more, which for me just happens to be like the film and like the X's and O stuff, but also acknowledging like the analytics have a tremendous value, and basketball analytics have come a long way, and they should be part of anyone's like discussion point, because they provide a lot of data that we just can't see sometimes. So they both have value. It's just a matter of like what you enjoy more than others, I guess.
Do you think that style, and I think my process is very similar to yours, do you ever get the feeling that it creates personal biases in terms of players you like maybe a player is more interesting to you to break down in film, and therefore you look for more positives from that player than say another player that's more boring to you, or more analytically popular but doesn't have the minutia to his game that you would enjoy breaking down?
I am 1,000% sure I do it. I know I probably fell more prey to that even like a couple of years ago than I do now. I'm trying to like think of an example of, all right, so like Quentin Grimes was like one for me that, and well, he's not even the best example. I think RJ Barrett is the best example, because actually when he got traded, I went back and like read all the tweets I put out there regarding him, and it was clear that I was like rooting for him to do well and using very like specifically curated film to make points that, as I stood back and like read my tweets, I'm like, with like the benefit of hindsight, like clearly I had a bias. Like I wanted this player to do well. I had certain ideas of like why he was potentially like a really high level player that could like be an all-star. And I was looking for those things and using the film to maybe validate opinions that I had prior to like, I even should have had them based on like anything, because he was a young player. And I was like, whether it was like what I thought of him coming out of Duke, or his certain flourishes, or like moments that he had as a really young player, first or second year, like I really wanted him to do well. And I fell prey to that idea that I was using the film to validate that opinion versus the other way of like just watching it and then forming the opinion, which, I'm sure there's players on the Knicks now that I do that with, and I'm not like necessarily aware of it because I'm like in it and doing it every day. But yeah, like I've definitely, it's really hard to not do that. And that's probably the best argument for like the more data-driven view of things, is because it can be you can sort of remove the emotional aspect of it probably a little easier than if you're watching that player grind and get better and put in all these like efforts and improve these skills that were clearly happening, but maybe not like rounding into shape. So yeah, I think there is that danger. I think it probably comes with doing it more and more to like remove that sort of like, I'm trying to think of the word for it, but like I think everyone that does film work can fall, can have this occur, and it's really important to sort of be aware of it and maybe not have really strong opinions, or have strong opinions, but be willing to move off them quicker than you think. So that was probably another issue I had, was like I kept those opinions longer than whether it was the film or the data probably told me I should have moved off them. So just, I guess, being willing to adjust based on whatever data you're using, film or analytics, but just don't be so like confident that you're right, I guess, is the summary of it.
Don't you worry, DJ. There's plenty of disingenuous people out there who manipulate data and analytics the way you were talking about. It's more. Don't give people the benefit of the doubt just because they got some numbers that support their point. It's really easy to manipulate that too. That was honestly an incredible level of self-awareness and humility, as far as I'm concerned, to like self-analyze yourself that way. That was pretty cool to hear, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really respect that, DJ, and I appreciate what you're saying, and that's how I was going to chime in. I think the opposite biases are almost, if not just as likely, because you can use and manipulate data in many different ways. You can cherry pick data. You can specifically point at certain things that certain people feel like justify their perspective, and you can really hone in and harp in on those things. And that can happen if there's like a metrics and analytics darling player out there. You know, if we don't see some of the data, people sharing some of the data that may go against, you know, some of those other top line, maybe the impact metrics or whatever the data may be, because people want to prop that person up. And so it happens either way. I don't think this is something that's super only particular to people who are using film. I think it's very particular to people who are using eye test, but yeah. I don't think it's super particular to people who are using film. I think anybody is susceptible to this because of the way that data can be used, and it's not clear which are the most important data points, what sample size is sufficient to draw certain conclusions. You know, there's just so much that goes into it. So I super respect what you're saying, and I think it's true for everyone. I think, you know, Geoff and I'll speak for us, can be susceptible to that as well. So I just think it's impossible not to, with as much data, as much information, as many things as we have. So yeah, I think it's a great message to end on if you want to chime in there, Geoff.
I just want to say one other thing that when you were going through your list of reasons that conversations can get muddied, conversations are never defined anymore. Like, we never even try to nail down what the actual conversation is. And it's incredibly frustrating to me. Think about the most prevalent conversation in all of NBA discourse, LeBron versus Jordan. Mm-hmm. There are no two people who have this conversation who are ever even talking about whether they're saying who's the better basketball player or who the better basketball player relative to their peers is. That's never even once been qualified in one of these discussions. It's always just, here's my extreme opinion and here's why your extreme opinion is dumb. And it's like, can we at least nail down what we're talking about here before, like, nobody tries to understand where somebody else's perspective is coming from. Nobody tries to understand. And when I say nobody, I'm being extreme. I know people out there argue in good faith. I'm just saying, for the most part, I think a lot of these conversations would be better if we really nailed down what the conversation is, what we're trying to figure out. You know, I had a conversation on Twitter with a Magic fan yesterday about Paolo versus Franz, and he was very dismissive of the take we had about Paolo on the NBA pod a week ago. And he was like, yeah, I found your whole take odd, and he was like dismissive. And I was just like, okay, can we just break down what you think, what your perspective is, and what we're talking about here? Because in my opinion, when you have the Paolo discussion, people muddy, are we talking about Paolo today, or are we talking about what we think he's going to be in 5 years? Because those are two different conversations, you know, and like, you can do this for just about any conversation. I think it's a really important part of discourse, especially when it comes to eye test and film versus analytics, because we really, really have to define what we're talking about if we want to try to, you know, find common ground.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, like, it's very hard to do that in some of the, you know, whether it's Twitter or, you know, social media in general has just made it very challenging to just have those conversations where it's defined. So like, doing this with you guys, it is the best way. I mean, we're humans. We need to be able to like look each other in the eye, even though we're in 3 different states, and be able to like have this conversation, flush things out. It's very challenging to do it. You know, when you're in front of a screen, you're doing it through text, and you feel like you're on stage for all the other people that are watching and gonna like or retweet this. And it's a very odd way of communicating. This is not. So like, doing more of these long form discussions is where, like, I think there's probably more appetite for this than there has been in years. I think people are just clamoring for that. So I guess I'll end with like, keep doing what you guys are doing, because it's an important thing that is not out there as much as it should. And it's very important for the discourse, and just seeing people for good faith, you know, debaters. It lowers the temperature, and then that is just a good thing these days. So props to you guys for putting these shows out there.
Yeah, really appreciate it, DJ. Couldn't have summarized it any better. This was a tremendous conversation. We're so appreciative of you coming out and hashing out some of these broad discussions and concepts with us. Super fun to break things down and get your deep insight into your perspective. You know, Geoff and I both tremendously respect and appreciate all the film work that you do. You put in work, man. Like, you drop stuff constantly. So if you're not already following him, follow DJ at DJ Ace NBA on X. and all of his work over at Knicks Film School. Tons of post games, tons of playbacks, all variety, tons of stuff on the main pod. So definitely follow DJ.
If y'all haven't seen the replay of XJ and DJ doing Game 5 of last year's Sixers Knicks game, just take 5 minutes and go enjoy the.
Why would you say that?
It was hilarious. They won the series. It was like literally the only sense of joy I got from that game at all was watching you guys.
A meltdown.
I felt like people got my pain. You know, that was just, oh man, y'all did immaculate work. And then you had to stay on and answer questions. Oh my goodness.
That was a rough night.
Yeah, really.
That was a rough night. But hopefully a lot less of those this coming playoffs for the team we root for. But thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
All right, guys. Thank you so much, DJ. As always, for Geoff and for DJ, this is XJ. This has been Hot Hand Theory.